Well, howdy, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to World History class. You may not recognize me. I actually have gotten a haircut finally and look as though I might actually be a respectable member of polite society for the first time in a few months. Anyway, today we're going to talk about one of the most important general trends in world history since the end of the Cold War, and that is the idea of the era of globalization. Now, this is a very important concept. We'll talk about it, in more detail when we get to economics in a couple years. But we're going to be pretty brief today. I expect this one to be 15 minutes or less, not because it's not an important topic, but just because it doesn't take that long to lay out the basics to the extent that we have to in this particular course. So, one thing that we didn't really talk about that was a major technological development was the invention of the computer in the 1940s. And actually, the roots of the computer are kind of connected to something called the Enigma machine, which was developed as a device to help decode. It was developed by the British as a device to help decode German coded messages, and they were able to kind of create like an algorithm to kind of decipher the meaning of the German code during the war. And the development that went into this Enigma machine eventually evolves into the creation of the computer. And computers used to be so big they were literally the size of a room. Nowadays, computers are so small that, they can fit in your pocket. I was going to grab my cell phone and then I realized, wait, it's filming me. So have you ever been like talking to someone on the phone, like, I can't find my phone, where is it? And you don't really realize that you're talking on it. That happened to my mom one time. So nowadays, we call them smartphones, but the reality is your phone is not a telephone that does a few other things. It's a computer that happens to make phone calls, right? I mean, if you actually look at it, the smartphone that you have in your pocket, if you have one, is probably a more powerful computer than what a lot of major businesses were using 20 years ago. So, or even 10, 12 years ago. So the original supercomputers, they called them mainframes and stuff. I mean, they literally took up entire rooms to do a fraction of what certainly your laptop can do, but probably even your phone. But either way, the development of the computer becomes a major development in the way business works, especially by the 1980s. And during that time, during the 1980s, there's a process begins with the Army, actually, of building a network of networks that becomes known as the Internet. And the Internet was functioning in certain like scientific and military circles by the late 80s, but it became common to use for like ordinary people by the mid 1990s. I remember it was right around 95, 96 when I would have been around 8 or 9 years old. That was when you started seeing commercials advertising people's websites and stuff like that on the TV. Because I remember being like, where did this www thing come from all of a sudden? And the early internet was kind of sad. It took you like, it would knock you off the telephone. You had to, dial up a connection on the telephone line. And if someone called you while you were trying to load a web page, the web page would disappear. And, it took like minutes to load a page. And honestly, the things about the internet that make it cool, like YouTube and iTunes and all these, even Amazon, weren't really there yet. So I really don't know what everyone was looking for or looking at anyway that was so interesting that, it would be worth the investment of time to get one of those pages to load back then, especially since you actually had to like pay by the hour, kind of like it was sort of like, even on your computer, it was like sort of like a data plan on your phone where like you had like a certain amount of gigabytes you could use or whatever. And, they would come, the first major provider was in America Online, and they would provide these like CD-ROMs that they started to give away like everywhere. Like every magazine you bought had like 2 or 3 AOL CDs that were connected to it that had 30 free hours of AOL with your copy of Newsweek or whatever. So, but like you literally would have to count the time. It's weird world to think about. But so I'm lucky that I have just enough memory of what the world was like before the internet. The one exception is I wasn't driving in the world before the internet, so I can't imagine what it must have been like to actually have to plot a route on a road trip by getting a map and a pencil and drawing it instead of having GPS. So I'm grateful I missed that aspect, but the rest of it was kind of cool having to remember the pre-cell phone world and all that. Remember, there was a time where if you wanted to talk to someone on the telephone, you actually had to call them while they were going to be home. But anyway, with the development of all this stuff, which changes the way the economy works in ways that y'all probably already understand, you have this is one factor. It's not the only factor, but this increasing computer technology is an amazing factor or a major factor in driving the economy away from being largely manufacturing oriented in the major Western nations like the United States, Britain, France, etc. And really, you could even include Japan and South Korea and some of the other capitalist Asian nations in this as well. Moving away from manufacturing and into technology and information-oriented economies, so that nowadays the main focus of the American economy is more on white-collar service jobs. Although obviously you still have to have your manual laborers and your agricultural laborers, but that's kind of where the focus of the economy has moved to. And with that, a lot of the manufacturing and stuff is now being done in what had been called third world countries or less developed ones. And this kind of which has helped pave the way for the development of multinational corporations that often will, manufacture things in one country, distribute them in another, have their offices in yet another, co-owned by investors from across the world. And these multinational corporations, therefore, are involved in, a major part of the fabric of life in many different countries. And with that, the combination of these factors and the need for alliances among the anti-Soviet nations in the Cold War, which then the Eastern Bloc nations were then invited into those structures at the fall of the Soviet Union, all leads to this phenomenon known as globalization, or increasing economic interdependence, where the economies of the world are now very deeply mingled. Actually, before I go further into that, I want to clarify one thing. I talked about how a lot of the manufacturing is shifted to smaller countries. There is a little bit of a stereotype that's wrong that says that, free trade agreements, which we're going to talk about today, kind of pushed all the manufacturing jobs to third world countries. More jobs were lost to automation than were lost to outsourcing. So really the reason why America has a lot fewer manufacturing jobs has more to do with the ability of robots and other kind of mechanized systems of manufacturing than it does jobs being sent overseas per se. However, there is a extent to which there are more manufacturing economies in less developed parts of the world. So. Again, and people started saying, "Oh, they shipped all the jobs to Mexico and China and blah blah blah." That's a little bit of political demagoguery. It's not entirely accurate. We actually manufacture more in the U.S. than we did in the glory days of American manufacturing. It just takes a lot less people to do it because of the way the technology has developed. So manufacturing is actually more productive, but you have fewer people with factory jobs. Anyway, so this period of increasing economic interdependence, where stock markets and all this stuff have gotten really, really intertwined. That's been a part of the world since the 1800s to a certain extent, but it has really accelerated in the last 30 to 40 years. And and with that, there were some attempts to create more kind of international regulation of how this international trade works. And so one of the first experiments started in the 1970s was something called the EEC, or the European Economic Community, which led to a lot of Europe, especially the Western European nations, agreeing to drop tariffs and agree to certain, or drop or limit tariffs, I suppose, and agree to certain um, economic conditions for trade. And the EEC was a pretty decent success. It then became known as the Common Market, and it increasingly evolved into something known as the European Union. And the European Union, though, I think, started as a great free trade agreement and evolved into something a little more harmful. And because what happens is the EEC slowly develops into this European Union where they actually set up basically a continental quasi-governmental apparatus where in a lot of major economic issues, the EU was able to kind of legislate over the sovereign nations of Europe. And so they even had a European Parliament, which actually had like delegates from the different countries acting as though they were part of a parliament, but these people were not democratically elected by their nations. They were appointed by government officials. And so the EU over time becomes kind of a movement away from democratic accountability and the control of the people over major economic decisions. And this causes a lot of flashpoints over how much these countries are now able to actually control their own economy. Because some of the things that they did, one of the main things that the European Union did was they established the euro, which became the common currency of all of the European Union. With the exception of Great Britain, which kind of maintained the pound system. And of course, we'll talk about Britain has now left the European Union. But the EU established the euro as a currency, and really it became a real competitor to the American dollar as far as the most meaningful currency in the world. There were some periods where the euro actually was stronger than the dollar. It hadn't always, it kind of goes up and down a little. The situation is now you can, if you wanted to, you could get in a car in Portugal and then drive into Spain and then into France and then into Belgium and then into Germany and then into Austria and then into Italy and then up into Greece. And, you could do that whole thing without ever having to exchange your money, which made it a lot easier to exchange goods and services across the continent and to integrate companies across the continent. And in that way, I mean, it was very convenient. But the problem was that arose with the euro was it tied everybody's economy to the same standard in such a way that when you have the taxpayers of more fiscally responsible countries like Germany, for instance, having to pay to facilitate and control the economic policies of countries like Italy and Greece that were spending money like drunken sailors. This happened in a financial crisis, 5 or 6 years ago, which, the whole euro was affected by the way that the couple of governments were acting, which then caused the European Union to try to bring pressure on Italy and Greece and some of the other countries that were struggling to change their domestic policies as far as their welfare state and so on. But the problem with that is now, on one hand, if you're Germany and you just let them do what they were doing, it's going to affect your economy, But then you don't want, the Germans and the French and the couple other more prosperous countries being able to tell the other countries what to do too. I mean, if you're Greek or Italian or one of the other ones that was struggling in that situation, you don't want someone from another country telling your government how they can how they are supposed to handle their domestic economic policies. And so, and this really becomes very controversial because part of the freedom of movement across borders included immigration as well. So basically, every country that was in the European Union basically forfeited their ability to regulate immigration within their nations because part of the deal was kind of free movement of people as well. And so with that, if you were concerned about, if you're an anti-immigration person, which I'm not personally, but if you are, you don't like, even if you're not, I still, I'm not, I'm kind of a softy on immigration, but I also want the government to be able, the American government to be able to decide the policy, whether I like the policy or not. I want that decision to be with us and not with some international organization. Well, so in Europe, that decision was taken away from these individual countries by the European Union. So this has spawned a little bit of an anti-EU movement that had its biggest success in Great Britain, with the movement ultimately becomes known as Brexit. And this takes place just a couple years ago, 2016. The United Kingdom actually votes at a nationwide referendum to leave the European Union. And it took years for this to happen, because it was a major controversy, but nonetheless, Britain has severed its ties with the EU, and then there's the question: is that the beginning of more of this happening or not? And time is going to tell about that. And I should say, too, part of the reason immigration, I forgot to mention this, part of the reason that immigration became such a controversial issue there in Europe was because of how many immigrants in particular have come to Europe from the Middle East that were Muslim, and just in the context of the war on terror thing that's been going on, which we'll talk about tomorrow, there was concern of increasing Islamicization. That's not a word. Islamicization, I guess, I don't know, of Europe, because there are now so many Muslims in parts of Europe that a lot of demographers think that by maybe 2050 that France might be a majority Muslim nation, which obviously is going to cause a very different culture than the culture that the French are used to, for instance, in terms of just the whether it's language, whether it's cuisine, whether it's of course, the religious life has already shifted. Europe was traditionally a part of Christendom, but is no longer, very, very few European nations are now actually a majority Christian. The majority of them are kind of very non-religious in nature now, with very small, even Britain is one of the more church-attending countries in Europe, has like 10-12% of church attendance on a week, So Europe is a lot more secular than it used to be, and then that makes the clash with Islamic the integration of the Islamic peoples makes it even a little bit more of a flashpoint in their society. So. With that being the case, that caused that to be a major issue. So Britain leaves the European Union, but the European Union continues. And the EU has always had this division between people that want it to be less powerful, people that like it the way it is. And then there's always been some people who want it to have become more formal and become like a United States of Europe type situation. And, the motto of that kind of side of things was ever closer union. But a lot of this was because Europe became, we talked about the years from 1789, all the way through, 1945. We talked about how nationalism was one of the most explosive ideas in Europe, and how it caused all this revolutionary nationalism, caused all this chaos in the 19th century. And then it became associated with Nazism and fascism in the 30s. And so, the European countries had wanted to not repeat the mistakes of World War II, they have not wanted another Hitler or Mussolini to arise, that in general, the idea of nationalism became a very poisonous concept to the European mind. And so they're very focused on international cooperation and so on. Now, whether you think the EU went too far or not in regulating economic affairs and taking away democratic accountability and so on, the early stages of when it was just a free trade agreement were unambiguously successful and helped bring about some great economic growth. And so it was kind of copied by several other similar pacts across the world. Here we had the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, between the United States, Canada, and Mexico, which which took tariffs to zero between those three countries and made it easier to move, you know, people, products, jobs, etc. Industry across across those borders, and that was a great boon to the North American economy as well. In general, free international trade is helpful, just as a general concept. It's more customers, more people to sell to, more people that can invest in your business. When you can do business across kind of arbitrary national lines, that's going to help you in a lot of ways. However, there can be some downsides to it. So, for instance, in the recent crisis, we saw that we had kind of make the mistake of making too much of our manufacturing of prescription drugs took place in China, and so they were able to kind of threaten us not to allow the companies to make to make the drugs and cause a nationwide pharmaceutical shortage if we didn't cooperate in certain things the Chinese wanted, as far as travel with the virus treatment, all this kind of stuff. So there's some dangers with it, as when you bring dictatorships into free trade agreements. I think we kind of made the mistake of integrating with the Chinese economy too much while they were still in a communist state. I would love to have a free democratic China as a trading partner in the future, but since that would require some, massive revolution that doesn't look to be happening any day now, I think, maybe that's one trade relationship we might be rethinking a little bit. But in general, as a general principle and general concept, it really is good to be able to trade across nations, because if you limit your customer base, and your investor base, you're limiting your economy to the tune of billions of dollars when you only trade within the confines of your own country or what have you. So certainly, worldwide economic growth has been a good thing. And it's led to great improvement, especially in the most impoverished nations of the world. You have, we've, what they call extreme poverty, which was like $1 a day living, was cut in half in the previous decade. Now, I don't know if the recent Corona recession has changed that stat, but that was true as of 3 or 4 months ago. So literally the amount of people living in extreme poverty in the world was cut by 50% within 10 years. And that is largely the result of an increasing global economy. One of the problems with our economy being so globalized and integrated is that when one country has a crash, everyone kind of has a little bit of a crash. So when the United States housing market crashed in 2008, it didn't just cripple the economy in the United States for 5 or 6 years. It crippled the economy of Europe, of Asia, of Africa as well. And similar things happen, when things go down as it relates to Middle Eastern oil, or as it relates to certain European or Asian markets as well. So, that's kind of the downside you pay of getting everything so tied together. So anyway, so that's, and another thing that's both a blessing and a curse that relates to globalization is the idea that on one hand, it's really cool, the fact that, all these different countries that had very distinct and unique cultures develop over periods of time. With the increasing globalization, the distinctions between those cultures has been blurred, which is cool because you get to experience the other culture, right? People in Japan are able to listen to American music. People in America are able to, listen to Japanese music if we want to. Although, there's a language barrier involved there. Certainly, but the Hollywood movies that you go to see at your movie theater are also the Hollywood movies being seen in China, in Canada, in England, in Australia, in India, in just about anywhere that there are movie theaters, basically. So on one hand, it's cool because now you can go see, if there was a really cool movie that was made in Japan or in Spain or in India or some other place, you can probably find it in America somewhere with subtitles. So you can experience different cultures. The problem is it also kind of causes a little bit of the significance of the place and the culture being distinct from the rest of the world. It kind of does allow for a certain amount of sameness to where you have McDonald's in India, which I feel bad because everyone says that like the American food that's been exported overseas is like the worst American food. Like the best American food they don't know about, but they all know McDonald's. It's sad. So that's a little bit of a controversial thing. Some of the countries, especially in the eastern parts of the world, kind of didn't like, a lot of the old guard really didn't like the fact that so many of their kids were trying to wear American blue jeans and use and consume American pop culture and so on. But it's also caused a lot of cool things to emerge that wouldn't have emerged if you didn't have the confluence of of different cultures, whether it's combining styles of music, or things like that. So cultures interact a lot more freely now, especially in the internet age, where you can find YouTube videos of musicians from West Africa playing a show in Mali, and then watch it on your computer screen here. So I mean, there's just a lot more. It's a lot easier access to other cultures, but it's also harder to find like I'll use the example of music, or you could apply this to cuisine or film, or any other kind of cultural thing. Like on one hand, it's cool, you can have access to all this international stuff, but it's also harder to find like the traditional style before it was influenced by American music, or what have you. So some of the old guard didn't like how Americanized the rest of the world was getting. But on the other hand, there's been some good things that have gone with that too. Like, honestly, the spread of democracy has a little bit of is partly connected with, this globalization thing. So the world's a lot smaller of a place than it used to be, and there's some headaches or growing pains that come along with that. But I think for the most part, it's been a good thing. But anyway, so that's globalization. Tomorrow we'll talk a little bit about the whole war on terror thing, 9/11 and all that jazz, and that will be our last video lesson. And then Friday, you can just work on your final test that will cover the last 2 weeks. So anyway, getting down to the end of the year. Y'all have yourselves a good day, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.